Good afternoon. Wow, you get very close to the mic. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'd like to call up Mr. Mike Tritico. He's from Restore, and he has a very special little presentation for us.
Our little environmental group, Restore, got into a big controversy starting in 2003 in Beauregard Parish, Louisiana, which is a rural, ultra-conservative, politically inbred parish. And if you try to get anything done there and you're not part of the little clique, you're considered some kind of a communist or something. Who knows what they think? Anyway, they call you all kind of names. But the fight was worth it. We have 23,000 people drinking inferior water. Instead of being drilled into the sole source, Chico Aquifer, the big agricultural interests were on the board of the waterworks, and they kept the public down in the inferior Evangeline and Jasper aquifers, which are 6 times higher in sodium than the Heart Association recommends. The pH in those aquifers is enough that you would have to get an NPDES permit if you water in your garden and it goes in the ditch. So we're getting nowhere. We asked the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic if they could help, and Professor Babbage and his students came in like a Panzer division of tanks and reinforced the small number of us that cared, and it's turned around. His strategy of trying to get an independent auditor to look at the waterworks actually worked. The independent auditor announced there were about 30 or 40 pages of things wrong at the waterworks after he finished the audit, and he had a whole bunch of recommendations. And he announced at the meeting that it was the first time he'd ever done an audit where nobody challenged his findings, and they agreed that they would do it, and they are doing it. So it's a complete turnaround, and thanks to Professor Babbage, we have this little plaque that says, "Thank you to Tulane Environmental Law Clinic for invoking the Safe Drinking Water Act on behalf of Restore and the 23,000 consumers served by the Beauregard Parish Waterworks District Number 3, 2009 to 2015. Thank you."
The great thing about my job is you get to take credit for all this work done by student attorneys and their clinical instructors. But I'm always pleased to do it, so thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Morgan Jackson, and I will be doing the introduction of today's panel. The environmental justice in Lake Charles, Louisiana. Is it possible? The national boom in natural gases production has brought a new industry to Lake Charles, an area already dominated by chemical plants, around which small, long-standing communities sit surrounded by pollution and other disproportionate impacts. 2 of these communities, Willow Springs and Mossville, has been on the front lines of citizen action for many years. Mossville, primarily African American, with roots that goes back to the Civil War, is now the target of a massive buyout by the chemical giant Celso. This panel also discusses several facets of the issues there is affected by the community of the Bayou d'Indy, the Pearson Loop, West Lake, Maple Woods, Salford, and Lake Charles community. Your moderator will be Corinne Dalen, the esteemed clinical professor of the Environmental Law Clinic. Can she?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We have 2 of our panelists here. We're waiting for a 3rd panelist, Monique Harding, who is at another event at Dillard University, but I understand will be on her way. So right now, I'll introduce, we've already met, Mike Tritico, and to say a little bit more about Mike. Mike is from the Lake Charles area, and he's a longtime environmental activist. In the mid-1970s, Mike Tritico worked to identify the source of hazardous pollutants that came from an open waste dip, waste pond or open pit in an area that was making the people in the area very sick from the emissions. They didn't know what was in it, and they didn't know where it was coming from, and the state wasn't telling them. And he worked then to empower people to find out what was there. And since then, he's been working with communities to do similar things and to protect them and to find out information that empowers them to make their communities a better and safer place to live. He has served back before there was a DEQ. He served on Louisiana's Hazardous Waste Plan Committee and also on the state's Water Quality Committee, and he also served as a member of a regional Coastal Zone Management Committee. And he is the founder of Restore, which was established in, actually he'll have to tell you, I think it was established in the 70s. 74. And also a co-founder of the Louisiana Environmental Action Network, or LEAN, which most of you have heard about. Okay, in addition, we have Wilma Subra. Wilma Subra is an environmental scientist with a long career of providing consulting services to communities to help them understand and deal with environmental health threats from toxic and other harmful pollutants released by the petrochemical companies. Ms. Subra served for 7 years as Vice Chair of EPA's National Advisory Council for Environmental Policy and Technology. She also served a 6-year term on the EPA National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, where she was a member of the Cumulative Risk and Impacts Working Group and chaired the Gulf Coast Hurricanes Work Group. In 1999, Ms. Subra received the MacArthur Fellowship Genius Award for helping ordinary citizens understand, cope with, and combat environmental issues, and she's working just as hard today as she has been over the past several decades. In addition, and we will have, hopefully, Monique Harding, who is an attorney and co-director of Advocates for Environmental Human Rights, a national nonprofit public interest law firm in New Orleans. Advocates for Environmental Human Rights fights for the human right to live in a healthy environment by taking on companies who violate this right and the government for not upholding this right. Ms. Harding represents an organization called MEAN, which stands for Mossville Environmental Action Network, and various disputes, and she will be discussing that when she gets here. I wanted to take a second to show you on the map the area of Louisiana that the panelists will be speaking about. It is, let's see how I'm going to do this. All right. So in the southwestern part of Louisiana, near Lake Charles, is where Mossville is located. And I can zoom in and show you that so you can see. Okay, there we go. All right. So where you see the word Westlake, right next to it, around where my cursor is Mossville. And that's the impacted community that Ms. Subra will be speaking about mainly. And Mr. Tritico will be talking about areas all up and down this waterway. But I just want to get you oriented if you're not from this area. So Ms. Subra, you could be first. And I'll bring yours up. Okay. Got it. Thank you so much. Okay, Wilma Subra.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to speak here. I understand this is the 20th anniversary. I've spoken at quite a few, including at least the first 3 years. And when the process started, we usually had an attorney, a technical person, and a community person on each of the panels. And it made a big impact on the community members who got to come here and talk to you about the kind of things that were going on in their community. So I've been working with the Mossville community and the Mean organization since the late 1970s. As you heard a little bit, Mossville is a historical African-American community founded in the 1790s in Calcasieu Parish, and that's in southwest Louisiana, as you saw from Corinne's map. Calcasieu is a heavy industrial facilities, and Calcasieu is the second largest industrial complex as compared to Cancer Alley, which goes along the Mississippi River from Baton Rouge past New Orleans. And there are a huge number of industrial facilities, 31 in Calcasieu Parish. So of all the parishes in the state of Louisiana, Calcasieu has the most heavy industrial facilities, and they release something on the order of 13 million pounds of toxic chemicals into the environment on an annual basis. Mossville itself is surrounded by 14 of these industrial facilities, and they release more than 3 million pounds of toxic chemicals into the environment on an annual basis. Those facilities, the 14, consist of 3 vinyl chloride production facilities that release 50 toxic chemicals, including vinyl chloride. And vinyl chloride is a unique chemical in that it is known to cause angiosarcoma of the liver. And it and asbestos are the only 2 compounds that they have a direct connection between the compound and the health impact that it causes. And then we have a lot of other chemicals that are released from the vinyl chloride facilities, including EDC, which is a carcinogen and a mutagen. Then we have a petroleum refinery in the Mossville community, 37 toxic chemicals, including benzene, known to cause human cancer, and it causes leukemia, and then sulfur dioxide, and then 8 petrochemical and specialty chemical facilities that release 40 toxic chemicals, including styrene. And then we have 1 coal-fired power plant that releases 12 toxic chemicals, including mercury. So here you see those 14 industrial facilities totally surround Mossville. And again, remember, Mossville was there first. So working with the Mossville community, in 1997, a law firm took some samples of individuals' blood and had them analyzed for dioxin. And the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry didn't quite believe that data. So they came in the next year and took some samples from Mossville community and had them analyzed for dioxin. So when you put those 2 sets of data together, the average was 68.3 parts per trillion, which was 3 times the national average, which was an outstanding concentration in the blood of Mossville communities. So ATSGR said, oh, it must have been a fluke, maybe something happened. They came back in 2001 and they did 22 individuals, 5 from that group that the law firm was representing and 17 from the one that they had done in 1998. And guess what? It was still 61 parts per trillion, still 3 times the national average. And what did they do about it? Finally put out a report, but didn't require the industries to reduce their emissions. So the industrial facilities that are releasing dioxin, one of the things is EPA did a toxic release inventory beginning calendar year 87 and had specific chemicals at that time, and then since that time they've been adding chemicals and industrial facilities that have to report. So thanks to EPA in 2000, they required the reporting of dioxin. And as a result, we had 5 industrial facilities that surrounded Mossville that reported dioxin being released into the air and into the water. And they were ConocoPhillips, the refinery, which is now Phillips, PPG Industries, Georgia Gulf, Sasol, North America, and there's a new Sasol coming in, but this is existing Sasol. And then the power plant, as you know, was the coal-fired power plant. So when you look at that data from EPA and you look at the ATSGR data, I went and looked at the dioxin congeners in both sets of data. The ATSGR gave me the data from the individuals, but not who they were. And so, lo and behold, Georgia Gulf, the top 5 congeners that were released by Georgia Gulf, matched the ones in the blood. Here you see the ones in the blood the top 5 were responsible for 77+%. And then when you compared it to Georgia Gulf, those 3 same top 5 had a total of 77.77. So the fingerprint of the congeners in the blood matched the fingerprint of the dioxin that was being released by the Georgia Gulf facility. They also did dioxin in homeowner samples. They did fruits, vegetables, and nuts from the yards of these individuals, and then they did fish that the people caught and the ones they were eating. So the attic dust had the highest concentration, over 900 parts per trillion of dioxin. And it was dust that had historically accumulated in the attics, because you don't usually go to your attic and clean the attic. You clean your house, you clean your yard, but you don't tend to clean your attic. And the dust and the fish all matched Georgia Gulf, Conoco, Sasol, PPG, and Energy fingerprint. Now the issue was the fish were really, really high, and so I asked ATSGR and the Health Department and the Wildlife and Fisheries in Louisiana to please list the fish for dioxin and have a consumption advisory. And they patted me on the head and said, we already have a consumption advisory for hexachlorobenzene and hexachlorobutadiene, and those same fish now have dioxin, so there's not a reason to do additional consumption advisory. So when we look at the history of science that has been developed, and this is the science that I've developed with the Mossville community, we monitored industrial activities, we recorded accidental events, we conducted workshops for the community, we tracked and commented on facility expansions over the years, and on new proposed facilities, because the idea was a lot of these things are sins of the past. We want to prevent new sins from taking place by being sure any new facility is appropriate and has as many controls as possible. We met with state and federal agencies and industry, providing the information and asking them to address the concerns and issues of the community. We sampled contaminated sediment and groundwater to identify the extent of the waste sites around there. We tracked the extent of mercury, hexachlorobenzene, and hexachlorobutadiene in the aquifer and in the water bodies that are consumed in the area, and Mike will talk a little bit about that as well. And then we worked with the environmental health and wildlife agencies to establish those consumption advisories on the hexachlorobenzene and the hexachlorobutadiene. In '86, EPA established the toxic release inventory that I told you about. So that time on, we began looking at the data, and every year when new data came out, we compared the trends of what was being released into the environment, into the air, land, and water, and what kind of trends were there. We provided the community with the quality releases and what it meant. We held workshops to educate Mossville community members on the chemicals, the quantities, and the health impacts and trends. And it's really important to always include the health impacts, because they know they're very sick, but they don't understand how this chemical correlates to that health impact. And then we met with the state and federal agencies and industries in attempts to get toxic emission reductions. In the 90s, we began collecting air samples for volatile organic compounds in response to odor complaints, because odor complaints occur frequently. We compared the results of the air samples to the chemicals that the industry said, when that event occurred, this is what we released. The main facilities that were the target of sampling events at that time were the Conoco refinery, sour crude coming in from Venezuela, and then smoking and excess flaring and purging of the process units at the refinery. The PPG had lots of chlorine and resin releases, and PPG would have chlorine releases, and they all had a chlorine respirator on their hip, but it would go over to the next industrial facility, and those people would have to be sheltered in place or moved out from the adjacent industrial facilities. And then Condir Vista, which became Georgia Gulf and Sasol, it was Condir Vista, and they divided it in half, and we get Georgia Gulf and Sasol, and they were having constant vinyl chloride and EDC releases. In '91, Louisiana enacted the ambient air standards for a number of toxic chemicals, including benzene, vinyl chloride, EDC, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylene, styrene, MEK, chloroform, and carbon tet. And this was done during the Romer administration when Paul Tremblay was head of the Department of Environmental Quality. So the results of these toxic ambient air monitoring stations were compared to the standards. And the Mossville area, it kept exceeding the standards. And so we met with the agency and said, look what it's doing. Vinyl chloride had a real small concentration. And like sometime in 2 months of the year for an annual average, we knew they would already exceed because they already had so much, even when you averaged it over the year, it was exceeding. And then they just keep patting us on the head and telling us it's no problem. So see, over and over and over again, working with the Mossville community, we had the data generated, we showed it to the agencies, and they were just sort of continually dismissing us. So 95 through 99, we had vinyl chloride monomer manufacturing process, involved chlorine used in the manufacture EDC, which is then converted to vinyl chloride. And the ambient air standards, as you see here, exceeded those concentrations, and that's when we kept going back to them and trying to get them to require the industries that were releasing the compounds that were exceeding the ambient air standards to reduce the amount of chemicals being released into the air. And in 99, we had a trace atmospheric gas analyzer, which is a Winnebago with a mass spec in it with a little kazoo out the side. And we were able, as citizens complained and petitioned the EPA, came to town and went on all the roads. It couldn't go in the industrial facilities, but it went on the roads, and it picked up huge quantities of, as you see, vinyl chloride and EDC over that ambient air standard. And in results of all this data, they didn't have the money to take the data and do something with it. They had the money to go in and run the van around, and they had outstanding data from it. So they gave me the data, and I had to do the plotting and then did the workshops for the citizens. And in one case, one of the people said, oh, what's that facility? Look at those high levels. And we went and looked it up in the phone book. They got the address, and they said, that's the one I've been complaining about, but I didn't know that those were the type of chemicals coming out of that facility. So it was really helping educate the community. And then 2001 and 2002, the industry paid for some additional monitoring. So there was a set point on a monitor, and when it exceeded the set point, a canister was collected. And then if it exceeded again, another canister, and then it would radio the person to come add more canisters. So we got data, and we were able to compare the accidental releases to the ambient monitoring in the episodes, and it matched. So once again, we were proving this facility was releasing these chemicals on an ongoing basis, these chemicals during accidents, and it correlated to the complaints from the citizens. But once again, you just get patted on the head. That's what you for. So the data obtained is what we did. In 2006, there were just huge quantities of chemicals that matched, and most of them were reported as going off-site, because you know they say, oh, well, it never crossed the fence line. But the data showed it was crossing the fence line. And then 2006 and 2007, we had the accidental unauthorized releases. And then in 2008, I did a health survey, and here's the results of the health survey. I developed the instrument. Advocates for Environmental Human Rights and me had citizens put the survey into action, and then I evaluated all the data, did the medical conditions, and then compared it to the releases of chemicals reported by the industry. 57 of community members considered themselves sick. The sick individuals were sick 3 days per month to every single day per month. Do you want to live in a community that you're sick every single day of the month? I don't think so. Would you like to drag yourself to college every single day feeling very sick? 17 reported occupational exposures, 88 had respiratory, next was muscle, shortness of breath, and again, the chemicals that caused these health impacts were Conoco, Sasol, PPG, Georgia Gulf. We were able to match the actual chemicals, and then so for each health impact, we put together this health impact is caused by these chemicals, and these are the facilities that are releasing them, and how much they are releasing them. There were 32 chemicals that were associated with the medical conditions from the health survey. 20 were released by PPG, 17 by Sasol, 16 by Conoco, 15 by Georgia Gulf, and 5 by Energy, the coal-fired power plant. So the information on the health impacts was used to educate healthcare providers at clinics in the Calcasieu area. And make them aware that when there's an accident, when today you get in 5 nosebleeds in the children, you need to ask, what's going on? And so we get them educated and they start calling the emergency response when they get a cluster of something. And emergency response would tell them what facilities had accidental releases and what chemicals. And I had shown them how to look up the chemicals to correspond to the health impacts. And then just when they would get all fixed up, then they transfer them to a clinic somewhere else. In 2010, we had the Environmental Protection Agency do sampling to determine if the area should be Superfund. And we sampled and split samples with them. They didn't do air, they did soil, and they did groundwater and surface water. They kept air separate, so it wasn't enough contaminants to say they would be Superfund, but the air was really, really bad, and they required the industry to reduce their emissions. And did they? No. So 2012, we did, EPA had a PVC emission control limit that would reduce the emissions from those vinyl chloride facilities in the Mossville area. And they had an area source, Certainty, and they decided not to require Certainty to reduce their emissions. So we petitioned, and we're still waiting on that process. And in 2012, Georgia Gulf applied for an air permit renewal and a modification. And the interesting thing is the agency required them to do modeling. And as a result of the modeling, they exceeded the ambient standards way off-site, all the way around. And the vinyl chloride was 5.6 times the ambient standard off-site. And the EDC was 5.2 times the standard off-site. So then DEQ said, well, tell us how much and what you have to do to come in compliance with the ambient standard off-site. So they said, well, we have to reduce one by 84%, the fugitive emissions, and the other one by 83%. And then they decided that in order to do that, they'd have to change all these valves, all these flanges, shut the plant down. And they said that it was not cost efficient to do all of that work. And the day they turned in that report, the next day, DEQ granted them the permit to continue operating and continue to have off-site impacts way in excess of the ambient standards. And so Mossville, Mean, filed suit against that. July 12, Georgia Gulf purchased chlor-alkali division of PPG and renamed it Axol. So you don't hear Georgia Gulf anymore, you hear Axol. In December of 13, PPG Axol plant had a major explosion and fire and released lots of vinyl chloride. And people traveling on Interstate 10, and you saw it on Corinne's figure, they were made very, very ill. It released EDC, vinyl chloride, hydrochloric acid as a result of the fire event. And then Sasol's expansion in December of 12, Sasol, which is South African firm, an oil company, announced an expansion, and they were going to spend $16 to $21 million on the expansion. As a result of that, they were going to build these two, the gas to liquid and the ethane cracker. And if you read the papers lately, they're saying they're going to hold off on the ethane cracker, but what they don't say is we're going to go ahead with the gas to liquid. And as a result of that, portions of Mossville were purchased for the footprint of the facility. And that went, quote, fairly well as they considered it. And then we petitioned them to buy the citizens around it in the fence line community, and that they were going to be purchased. Some of them are purchased, some of them are still there, and Dorothy was going to talk about that. So at the same time, the community is in desperate need of a medical clinic to treat their health conditions due to exposure to the industrial facility chemicals that are being released into the environment. And what's happened is they purchased the land for the footprint, and then they purchased the land around that, and they're going to put various units that are, quote, not needing permits. So they've now created a new fence line community and it's the communities of Sulphur and Maplewood. So no matter what you do, it keeps expanding, and as a result, the story of Mossville is like many other contaminated, polluted, vulnerable, and unhealthy communities. Science can benefit the community in understanding and addressing the issues, but it also depresses them, and it gives them an awful lot of burden on them when you start providing the information of how bad it is, how bad the health impacts, how much of the chemicals are being released. But it's better that they have the information. They need that information, and then they need to be able to make decisions for their own community on how they move forward. Thank you.
Next, we have Mike Tritico, and Mike, I can bring that map up, would you like? Yeah. Okay. Let's see. No, I can hand out. Right, so here you go. Yeah. You want to go up there? Okay. Uh-huh. Okay, do that. All right. And if you want to zero to, this either way, whether it or out, if you want to move it.
This is.
Okay, great. There's.
Well, thank you for letting me come here today, and thanks to Wilma. She's a real hero, and she's told you some things, but you can guess. The whole thing is a terrible soap opera. It's been going on for years. And one of the questions is, why Southwest Louisiana? And the answer I've come up with through the years growing up there is that we've never got out of the Reconstruction era, and the carpetbaggers come in from everywhere, Pittsburgh, South Africa, and they exploit our people, they exploit our resources, and they are aided and abetted by what in our old civics and Louisiana history classes were called scalawags. Local hometown hustlers that know how to manipulate a system to make their buddies rich. So I think we're still stuck in Reconstruction, and it doesn't look like it's going to change. This, for instance, this Sasol project, 26 billion with a B, 27 billion actually. The state budget, Louisiana state budget for an entire year is 26 billion. So that's how big the Sasol project was supposed to be. Bigger than the entire state of Louisiana with all of its expenditures for everything. All in one industrial project, supposedly the biggest industrial development in the history of the United States. That triggered what people were calling a big boom in Southwest Louisiana, and everybody wanted to get on the bandwagon. And the economists from McNeese and LSU, it was like donkeys hitched to a bandwagon, pulling it through a quagmire of manure and quicksand. I mean, you should have seen these economists and everybody else bragging about the big boom. Well, now, as Wilma said, Axiall is reneging, so is Sasol. And meanwhile, local people that rolled their dice and invested all of their savings in things like man camps and service industry expansions and all sorts of things, they're stuck with the banks beginning to pull back financing. So it's a mess. Instead of a big boom, it's a big bust, and it's coming unraveled. That Sasol project does not involve any liquefied natural gas. It does involve the Haynesville Shale fracking gas that will also be used to make the liquefied natural gas. But on this map, you can see the way it's expanded now. You can see from DeQuincy to the Gulf. That's Calcasieu Parish through Cameron Parish to the Gulf. And the PARs that Wilma described, there are about 8 or 9 such neighborhoods. It's not just Mossville. The Bayou Den community, they're all dead now except for brother and sister Arena and Robert Davis. But Bayou Den was surrounded, and it was supposed to be a Superfund site, but the state representative freaked out, and it's not a Superfund site, and the cleanup was just a farce. They're going to dig up the hot spots in the bayou and put them in the marsh by the I-210 bridge, put in 6 inches of clay, and put in marsh grass, and hope that the tides don't wash all that stuff back out into the fish. So it's not just Mossville. Bayou Den is dead. Pearson Loop was bulldozed very quietly with no publicity. And this was before Love Canal and Times Beach. I mean, we've had horror after horror in southwest Louisiana that got suppressed. The press coverage doesn't exist. I don't know if in New Orleans any of you might remember a little newspaper called the Blue Carré Courier. That was done by a person from our high school, LaGrange, that got a cub reporter job at the Lake Charles American Press and wanted to do a story on the orange fumes, the nitrous oxide fumes that were coming out of the Olin plant. And when it would be misty or rainy, it would peel the paint off the cars that were going on the interstate. So he wanted to do a story, and he couldn't. So he ended up in New Orleans starting a muckraking newspaper called the Blue Carré Courier. And Bill's dead now, but he did a tremendous job for about 15, 20 years. But that's the kind of suppression that's part of what happens in southwest Louisiana. People get suppressed, they get intimidated, economic blackmail, like, I don't know, 1937, the Couchy Rod and Gun Club, when Olin, well, it was Matheson Alkali, opened the first outfall and killed fish for 30 miles. The Couchy Rod and Gun Club, the hunters and fishermen protested, and they were told to shut up, we need the jobs, this is progress. And it's been that same kind of suppression by the carpetbaggers and scalawags ever since. It's still happening. We did have with Willow Springs, which Mabel Rigmaiden Jones, an African-American lady in 1968, passed a petition, went to the police jury with it, and got laughed at. By 1976, the fumes from those pits were so bad that people, no matter which way the wind would blow, people were getting sick, choking. One lady had to run outside, pick up her husband, and drag him back inside because he had collapsed, and this was about 4 miles away. Those pits were lethal. And Mabel was ignored, but finally other neighborhoods joined forces. There were black people, white people, rich people, poor people. All the neighborhoods around the whole area, which was a great variety, were afflicted, and they joined forces. And we bumped out a bunch of rotten politicians. The incumbents freaked out and began to say, okay, wait, what's going on? We didn't know about it. What are we going to do? So we bumped out a bunch of people, and we ended up joining forces with other neighborhoods, like the group from Bayou Sorrel, the ones fighting Rollins. And that's when we founded the thing called LEAN, an umbrella group, statewide, because it wasn't just Calcasieu Parish. It was statewide, just a total nightmare. And it's been that way, but it's also been humorous and funny, and right now I'm not in a humorous mood, so I can't think of any. But we have had to have a sense of humor through this, or it would have killed us. And some of the funniest things have happened, but I'm not going to get into that. What's happening now with this map I want to show you is that the afflictions from the industrial emissions that Wilma was talking about, the direct emissions from the plants, that was one aspect of what has happened, like from the Lake Charles and Prien Lake upstream, along with the hazardous waste disposal sites. But what's getting ready to happen with the liquefied natural gas terminals is a whole new set of neighborhoods downstream. It's a completely different kind of thing. One of these natural gas storage tanks has the kind of equivalency, energy-wise, of 40 Hiroshima atomic bombs. Already there are built 3 in South Lake Charles, 3 in Hackberry, going to be 5 there. And there are going to be 6 in Sabine Pass, Louisiana. On the Louisiana side, there are already 4 built. Already we have plenty of Hiroshima atomic bombs that are in place. If all of these proposed LNG plants are built, they're going to be like triple that number of tanks. And each ship that comes in, and they're projecting 100 ships a year, each ship, when it's full, will have 60 to 80 Hiroshima atomic bombs worth of energy in it. I mean, we're not supposed to say things publicly. A lot of the LNG stuff is classified and not released to the public, because if the terrorists ever think about it, this proliferation of LNG tanks in southwest Louisiana is going to be a prime target. And that is sad, because if one of those tanks ruptures, it won't be a blast. It'll be, this liquid will spread until it gets enough oxygen and reaches a spark. And then it will be a huge whoosh and sparks people half a mile or more away. And that is going to be sad. People are going to say, why didn't we think of that? You know, how could we have let such a thing happen? Burned up University Place, Lake Charles, one of the, you know, exclusive neighborhood. Graywood Plantation is within the range of trunk line if it loses a tank, or 3 tanks, or 5 tanks. So the safety issue, Restore, our little environmental group, I think it was 1978, we submitted comments prior to the building of the trunk line station. We were ignored. We then asked the fire marshal, the state fire marshal, to look into it on the safety issue. You know, I still have the letter and everything, but we got no reply. It's not that people haven't tried. It's not that we didn't see it coming. But someday when you hear of a terrible, catastrophic LNG fire that roasts a bunch of children, and they say, how could we have let this happen? You know, nobody thought of that. Well, it's not true. It's like all of these permit hearings that we've done. Yes, we've thought of it, and like Wilma said, they pat you on the head and say, go away. What does it take for citizens to have the power against the carpetbaggers and scalawags? I don't know. I have stopped guys with dynamite. They had 2 cases of dynamite, and they were going to blow up the Willow Springs injection well, and I said, wait, think about it. In the first place, you're going to splash that stuff all over your own neighborhood, and will never get cleaned up. In the second place, you might kill the night watchman. He's just a good old guy. He's making minimum wage. In the third place, you know who they're going to come question. And they said, well, you're going to rat on us? I said, no, I'm not, but I'm just asking you not to do it. And they didn't. And sometimes I think maybe I should have let them do it. Same thing with the deer rifles. We had, when the Livingston train wreck happened, there was a BFI hazardous waste site right there at Livingston. Livingston people were all upset. So they sent all of the dug up dirt with the perchloroethylene in it, they sent it to Willow Springs in truck caravans. The state representative, Strain, owned the truck company. He got upset because the state troopers were giving his guys speeding tickets, because the more trips they could make in a day, the more money they made. And so the troopers were doing their job, stopping them before they ran over somebody, which, by the way, 2 of the Restore members got run over by hazardous waste trucks, no witnesses. But anyway, the caravan of trucks from Livingston was jamming the roads at Willow Springs. And so the guys said, we're gonna make this a crystallized image. We're going to shoot the tires out, and we'll have about 50 18-wheelers totally stranded, totally blocking everything in the whole vicinity. And then people will realize what we're up against. And I said, okay, what if you ricochet and it goes into Harvey's house? And what if you ricochet and it hits one of the drivers? And so they didn't do it. Sometimes I think I should have let them. It's been a long, hard haul. And trying to do it the right way has been very frustrating. There was a group of old men that, you know, it was sort of like a secret pact of whichever one of us gets a terminal disease first, here's what they're going to do. Well, they've all died except me, and nobody did anything, so it's left to me. I'm too tired to go do anything except come talk to y'all. So these industries do not realize how much they've lucked out. If they get hit by terrorists, it won't be homegrown terrorists. It could have been, but we were Americans, and we didn't do it. So when it happens, they need to appreciate what they did to us, because we tried to do it right. I've got posters there to remind me of things, because my mind is getting tired. Oh, the subsidies. That's why I have the posters here. Mentioned the state budget, $26 billion, and the Sasol budget, $27 billion. But the subsidies, for instance, the Cheniere Sabine Pass LNG plant, General gave them $1,689,328. $1.6 billion, okay, to Cheniere. That meant that the total cost per direct job created was $2,912,000 something. So why not just give the guy the $2 million, okay, instead of creating all this risk? Sempra at Hackberry, they have a mega deal of $2,194,868,648. The taxpayer cost per job created is $11,551,940. So for one job in Hackberry, it costs the state of Louisiana taxpayers over $11.5 million. Now that makes no good sense. They're talking about cutting manganese, the school I went to. They're talking about shutting down whole departments. For the first time this past week, Matney's had a seminar and brought in our elected officials from that region and made them say what they're going to do next year. Are you going to cut us again? We're already cut to where we can't do our job. And a lady professor went on television and said the money should be coming to the people, not to the companies. And that was a breakthrough. I could hardly believe it because Matney's has been so cowed by these companies. I mean, they give them a used computer. It's just like the partners in education. They give some grammar school money for a field trip, and they get a big sign in front of the school. And yet their tax break has to be picked up by the other taxpayers, the people that live in the neighborhoods. So it's just a not right situation. It's unfair. I guess I've covered the main concepts of the safety, the new proliferation to other neighborhoods, the subsidies, and there's so many things I could talk about, but I don't know what your main interest is. I could answer your questions, or we may be out of my time. I don't know.
Well, I thought we would have questions for both you and Ms. Subra. Whatever the questions may be, we can direct them appropriately. And does anyone have a question yet?
Yes, to Ms. Subra or Mr. Tritico, I was wondering about if a pregnant person had all those toxins in them from Mossville, say, and moved to a pristine area if one exists, and she's pregnant. Can she pass these toxins on to her child? And I'm not talking about breastfeeding. I'm just talking about when she, delivers the baby. Can that baby have those toxins in them?
I couldn't hear.
Oh, okay. If a woman who has the toxins from the 5 companies in her body and she
Moved to a controlled area, controlled
moved
setting.
to some place that didn't have these
Right.
problems but was pregnant, had a baby, could these toxins be passed
Sure,
to the baby?
and the toxins it moves across the placenta, and it
That's what I wanted.
does get in there.
Okay.
And that's why we're looking to set up a toxicology clinic to specifically deal with the exposure to the people from the chemicals. And, it's just not working. We can't get anybody to commit because it's really going to be pointing the finger back at the industries out of the source. And so it's been very difficult to get that toxicology. The clinic in Lake Charles sees them when they have respiratory problems, but they're not toxicologists.
I have another question, and I'll
Sure.
Mr. Tritico.
That's my sister, by the way.
Embedded.
When we were growing up, we'd go crabbing a lot, okay? And depending upon where we crabbed, some of the crabs were healthy, and some of them had worms in their eyes. Was this caused by pollution?
Parasitism in all these aquatic organisms and waterfowl is exacerbated. The animals have a diminished immune response. And
Because
yet,
where we caught those worms was in Lake, was it Lake Charles, I
up
believe?
and down the whole Calcasieu estuary
Yes.
has these
Yes.
immune suppressing chemicals and endocrine disrupting chemicals and cancer causing.
And when the first consumption advisory for seafood came out in Calcasieu, and again, that was under Romer, the commercial fishermen and the commercial markets that buy them from the commercial fishermen put real pressure on DEQ and Wildlife and Fisheries and Health Department not to issue a ban against them being able to harvest it and purchase it. It was one thing to tell people they shouldn't eat, or they should only eat this much each month, but don't go near that commercial issue.
But you see,
And that's how it went through.
and when we were Catholic and we grew up and we had to eat fish on Fridays.
You've reminded me of something funny. Well, when the fishermen and crabbers and shrimpers and oystermen realized that advisories had finally been issued after 11 years of trying to show the science to the state, they got really irate, and they called Randy Roach, who's now mayor of Lake Charles, called a big meeting at the Coliseum, the rodeo arena. And there were 700 or 800 fishermen there, and they were all mad at me because I'd been one of the people who had said we need to have some seafood advisories. People are eating poisoned seafood. So I was standing in the back with people heckling me, and one of the guides from Cameron Parish, Sammy Falk, was standing by me, and PPG's lawyer and science guy came up, and Bernie, the attorney, said, "Mike Tritico, we're taking names and kicking ass." And I said, "Bernie, you've had my name for years." And at that point, Sammy burst out laughing, and Mark Wood of PPG grabbed Bernie before he could whip my ass and pulled him back. And at the same time, a guy held up a big poster and said, "I'm the one that dumped it in the river." And that was Lee Sherman.
Yeah.
And so I said, wait, I got to go meet that guy. And so Lee, a so-called disgruntled employee, he provided us with all sorts of inside information that carried us through some of these studies. He was one of the blood volunteers. He was a worker, and he had high docs and reading. So, I mean, we have had some breaks. We've had some good things happen. But the fact is, those guys know they've got Southwest Louisiana sewed up. They set precedents in court. They go national. They have zeroed in there because that's their place. They've got it. It's a sacrifice zone. They hired spies to break up the group clean. You know, it's been a nightmare and a comedy at the same time.
So,
David?
if Louisiana is a sacrifice zone for the nation, and Lake Charles is Louisiana's sacrifice zone, I wonder if it's possible. You know, the title of this lecture, is it possible to have environmental justice in Lake Charles? Do you believe?
I see one way it's going to happen, and I testified to this in the Sasol hearing, which, by the way, usually nobody shows up for the hearings except me, Deborah Ramirez, and her mother from Mossville, Brother Reno from Bayou Den. But I testified that gas-to-liquid project was not ever going to go to fruition because it was going to starve thousands, if not millions, of children. The highest and best use of natural gas is as a molecular ingredient in the Haber process to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere to make fertilizer with. In other words, to feed the world, we need artificial fertilizer. The only way we can do it is to use methane as a building block, not a fuel, a building block. And if we burn it all up as a fuel, 100 years from now, kids are going to be starving, not just all over the rest of the world, but the United States too, because we won't have any artificial fertilizer. So I said, the Creator's not going to let that happen. That's not going to happen. Sure enough, it's becoming unraveled. They've already reneged on the gas-to-liquid thing. Axiol is reneging. And I don't think that all these LNG plants are going to get built because there's all kind of a crash in the commodities market and all that. It's like the Creator said, okay, somebody finally said it, now I can act, bam. And that's why I think that a lot of this is going to get straightened out directly by divine intervention, what they used to call act of God, force majeure. It's coming from God, though. That's my personal opinion.
I have a question. My question is, you said that you've been doing this for 30 years and now you're tired.
Yeah, I'm real tired.
And I didn't come to Tulane for the environmental, to be a part of the environmental, but I do live in Louisiana and I care about what's going on here. I just wanted to know what can we do? Like, what is your recommendation to us? What can we do about it? Because it just seems like it's so gigantic. You know.
Educate people so they can understand what's going on in their community. And hopefully they will get involved enough to get involved on the state level and the national level. If not, They're going through their daily lives with everything that they've got to face. And you saw how much data we developed over the years, and it's still just pat you on the head and tell you go away. But you've got to educate them so that they can get involved and have a larger mass of speaking out. And as a result of a lot of the work I've done, the citizens always have leaders that float to the top like cream in the milk. And then once they have gotten a handle on their situation, they start helping other communities as well. So it's that interaction of the communities. But you have to educate them.
And almost every community that has done anything starts their meetings with a prayer. It's really, there's a divine link here. And even though we are the front line in Southwest Louisiana, we're also the place where people can have a link to the Creator and say, hey, we can't overcome this exactly unless you help us. And He does.
I have a follow-up question. Oh,
There are a lot of people with questions.
There's some over there.
oh, okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
About what Mr. was saying about education, I mean, obviously in these areas like Westlake and Lake Charles with the chemical plants and the refineries and facilities, there's a lot of money coming in, there's a lot of jobs and money being put back into the community. What exactly would you say, like, to educate someone, either of you, to someone who's living in these areas who just kind of chooses to see the benefits rather than the cost of living there?
I can't understand it.
Do you want me to say about it?
What I would say first is that the unemployment rate in Lake Charles has gone up since 2013 to 2014. With all the hype about the big boom, the unemployment rate went up. Those jobs are promises, not realities. And the subsidies are realities. They get their money, they stick it in the bank, they get the interest, and the taxpayers don't. Unless all that gets straightened out, it's just a lopsided, pro-industry situation.
And most of the communities that live around do not get the jobs, or if they get the jobs, they get it with a service company to maybe deliver food for events and things like that. But they don't get the jobs within the facility that would be good paying jobs.
Lynn?
Y'all may be the wrong people to ask this question. I know we're missing someone. But I'm curious to hear some discussion about the potential buyout, if either of you is willing to comment on that. I have mixed feelings about it. Part of me says it makes sense if we're creating these environmentally dangerous areas around these industrial complexes, then it makes sense to move the people to a safe environment for them to raise their families and live. On the other hand, I also understand that we have communities that go back hundreds of years with people who have long and strong ties to their community, and that just making people pick up and move is unfair, and I have no idea whatsoever what the economics of moving them looks like. Is someone actually paying them a fair amount of money to replace or better their living conditions if they move? Again, y'all may be the wrong people to ask, but I'm very curious about that.
The buyout?
Yeah, so I'll answer it in two ways. One, we just completed last month the buyout in Bayou Corn from the sinkhole. And they received a fair buyout. They would have liked more because they were put in this limbo for 2.5 years. But they received enough money that they could go and build a comparable house in a comparable area. The problem was there was no other area like Bayou Corn where they could purchase a lot. Whereas in Mossville and with most of the buyouts, they don't receive enough to be able to reestablish the same thing they had at a new location. And then they don't receive anything for their suffering and the exposure they've gone through. So you may have a wonderful house, you love the house, 3 generations grew up, and you can't create something ideal just like that based on the amount of money that's being offered.
Is it in again, I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut anybody off, I'll just ask this one question. Is this a negotiation negotiated process or is there litigation around this?
Negotiate, how is this determined buyout? Is it litigation or?
No, not litigation.
They're
We've had a lot of
in
litigation.
negotiation.
Part of Mossville did get relocated through litigation. But this was an offer. They, like I said, they did the footprint first, where they needed to be able to have their facility. And then we met with them and asked them to do a larger area. And they came up with a plan. And it had all the criteria and it had all the calculations. And it wasn't near enough to reestablish what they had.
Thank you, thank you. There were some questions over there.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask, Mike, is there, in the subsidies portion, is there any clawback clause in their negotiated?
Well, I asked and finally got an answer about the $115 million grant, total gift, that Jindal gave to Sasol to do the buyout. And I was told by the state that the money had not yet been transferred, and it would not therefore be transferred since Sasol was reneging, at least temporarily. So maybe, I'm not positive about all these mega deals. I don't know how much money gets transferred and that sort of thing. It's something that needs to be really explored by people with more energy than I have.
And they're contending that the state money was for that footprint buyout, not the additional buyout of the fence line community.
Well, I'm asking for more than just the buyout issue. I'm talking about the outright subsidy that the state gave to these industries to locate or to expand. Was there a clawback should they renege?
I don't know the answer to that question, but it appears that they're very comfortable just asking for more money and taking more money. The ones at Subra, they've got their construction underway, the same thing at Chenier, same thing at Trunkline. Those guys seem well satisfied that the money is in their bank, if not already soon. And but they're not reneging, so I don't know what the answer to your question is. I do know that there was a $200 million federal grant to Lake Charles Clean Energy, which was going to take petroleum coke and process it and sequester the carbon instead of putting it in the atmosphere. And they canceled their project. And I still don't know if the $200 million came back to the federal taxpayers.
Richard?
Yeah, well, my question is, you know, we've heard that there's a really bad situation. We've heard that lawyers have been around. We're all lawyers. I guess my question is, why didn't the litigation manage to solve any of the problems?
I've worked with plaintiffs' attorneys on several different cases. And for instance, on a dioxin case, you saw how Wilma has worked the science for all those years. I worked it also. And part of what happens is the plaintiffs die or they get frustrated and refuse to do their answers to interrogatories or sign their medical things. They get, you know, like after 5 years, you're not getting anything done, to hell with you, you know. So it's very hard to sustain a case that long when people start out with a hope and it takes 10 or 15 or 20 years to get somewhere. The dioxin case that one of the firms that I worked with got last year, it was not renewed. Every 3 years, new interrogatories had to be filed and all that kind of stuff. This time they didn't refile because there was no good new information from ATSDR. That's what they've been waiting for. Instead, there was a draft error report. And so the law firm said, we've invested too much money in this already. That's it. So it's very hard to push one of these things through, and therefore the companies escape.
Wilma, do you have anything to add to that question as to why some of your data hasn't been used successfully by plaintiffs' attorneys to resolve some of these problems?
They have access to all of it. Why they don't take it and use it, I don't know, but they have access to all of it.
I want to add to that, I've seen it, an expert witness got bought off. These things happen and you can't prove them, but you know that's exactly what happened.
Yes.
I'm wondering if, not that I have a lot of confidence in this, so I'm not all wide-eyed and bushy-tailed and Pollyanna about it, but sometimes when the workers inside facilities get protections, say through an OSHA investigation or a state investigation, that actually helps people in the communities too, and because sometimes that regulatory structure has some teeth. So have you gotten any benefit at all from worker safety related efforts that have a trickle out benefit for y'all, or not so much?
The safety aspect?
I saw it happen one time. I was working with an attorney in Baton Rouge on behalf of the people of Springfield Road and Allison community. And the attorney was also handling cases for the Allied workers next door to the Rawlins plant. And a fume cloud came from the out-of-control incinerator at Rawlins, and 3 of the Allied workers fell to their deaths. But there was not a lost time accident because they were dead before they hit the ground, no longer employees. But when that happened, it changed the thinking of some of the people in the community who had been like, why don't y'all go away, we need those companies and all. When that happened and the workers told what happened to their friends and the way it was handled, it began to change the course of the litigation against Rawlins. And eventually compromise was reached. A guy named Pat Screen was a mayor of Baton Rouge, and he supposedly was the person who saw the compromise, and he was a politician and a former football star. And there were 2 of us who didn't sign the compromise. Kip Holden and I refused to sign the compromise. And eventually we had to do it. They said that if we didn't sign the compromise, Pat Norton, who was head of DEQ, would go bankrupt. And so they put that pressure on us. But at least the course of things got better, and the company and the state knew they had to do something more meaningful than just trying to cover it all up. So that was one case where a worker safety thing had an effect. That's the only one I can think of.
And so
And those same workers at that same facility were made sick when the petroprocessors started excavating their waste to put it in a cell.
Sure.
And so that shut that remedy down, and the remedy was changed to covering it with clay and pulling it out with recovery wells.
Right.
And as a result of that cell that was built, this one company receiving lots of payments to the governor we have now, applied to make it an industrial waste landfill. And the 3rd time the agency gave them the permit, and we're in court appealing that. But it was because those same workers at that same plant were made sick again, by Rollins and then by Petro.
But so you get my question then, and so, but for you in particular, you're not experiencing the same sort of benefit, if you will, from a worker safety approach trying to change something about plant operations that benefits people in the community. So far, no dice.
Not really.
It stinks.
But we hear a lot from the workers about what's going on and what they were released, and you need to know when off-site, even though the report said it didn't. But we hear that, but it doesn't. It just adds to the data we had, but not really moving forward.
Could you speak to the organizing tactics and the activism that made the Bayou Corn buyout fair, or in your view, fair? What made that buyout different than the other?
So when Bayou Corn first started in August of 12, it was releasing lots of crude oil into the pit, and it was making the people in the community very, very sick. So I put together what was called an odor and symptom log. We put it on the Lean website, and the people could go on the site, fill it out, and it asked them about what the odors were and what the health impacts were, and they'd hit a button and it would come to my computer. And when I get 3 or 4 or 5 at a time, I'd go look and see what the earthquakes were doing, and then call and see what the pit was doing. And I presented that here at the conference the next year, and a lot of the lawyers were interested in the odor and symptom database. And of course the health department came to the community and went through all the chemicals and all the health impacts, and then they ended it by saying nothing exceeded the level, so none of you people are sick. And the whole building was full of people who were sick. But they brought a class action suit, and the buyout was as a result of the class action suit. But it never got tried. It just got settled.
You talked about the psychological impact on the community of gathering data on all the scientific information. I was curious what you think, if there'd be value to the community in gaining real-time air monitoring along the fence line of some of these facilities and then making that publicly available. Is that something that would be of interest to communities, or have you tried that?
Yeah, we do a lot of air monitoring. We also look at a lot, in Lake Charles, there's a number of ambient air stations by DEQ and then by the industry, and then we do like grab samples when an event occurs and match it up. And when I showed you that episodic initiative, we got really good data then. So we can say it was Georgia Gulf releasing vinyl chloride. Here's their report of the accident, and it moved, and this is the concentration we had in the community.
But I mean, as it's happening, if each facility had to put fence line monitors on their fence,
Okay,
and then you had it on a website that
and
everybody could come in
we've
and
asked
get-
for that in a lot of permits. The industry has it, like where PPG is, they have it as chlorine monitors, so they'll know when their chlorine is going across into the next industry to notify them that chlorine. So they have a lot of it. And then some of the industries have it on either side of the interstate, because if you notice, the interstate goes right through the industrial corridor. And so they are checking that facility south when the wind is blowing in their direction, so that when they get blamed for it, they can go like, oh, no, it was them. Look, we have the data. But that data is never made publicly available, so we can't use that to plot what was going on. And that was why it was so good when that Tagger truck came in, because they went up and down all the residential streets, and they were there long enough that the weather was changing, so they would get it in different weather patterns. And the amazing thing is, at that time, there were only two. And so one was up in the northeast in the garage. And as soon as it left its garage, the industry was tracing it. And when it got to Lake Charles, they knew it was there. And in that time period when they were there was like 4 accidental releases. And it was just little minor things. Somebody had a gas leak at a meter. They knew that it was there, and they operated very cautiously, and yet we still had all these huge concentrations. So that was the best of conditions they could operate on, because they knew it was there. And as soon as it left, the accidents went up, the concentrations in the air went up. We could track it by all the monitors we had.
Wilma, the Tagger truck was an EPA truck?
Yes.
The question is, was it an EPA truck?
Oh, the EPA truck is a trace atmospheric gas analyzer. It's a Winnebago, and now they have a Bluebird camper with a mass spec in it with the low kazoo out the top. So it draws in the air, runs it, and gives them real-time data as they drive down the roads.
All right, we'll take a couple more questions and then give you a chance to get to the 5 o'clock panels.
Yes, has there been data compiled on cancer clusters in this area, particularly rare ones like angiosarcoma?
She wants to know about documentation of cancer clusters in the area.
I did a presentation at a national conference on the cancer clusters in Louisiana. We have one at the Agricultural Street landfill here in New Orleans East, where there was a statistically significant incidence of breast cancer on the citizens that lived there. When they brought us, ATSTR brought us that information, they said, this is going to get the community relocated. This is so severe. And the next week, it was like, never mind. There's a cluster that was in Martin City when Marine Shale was operating. It was a neuroblastoma. And so those are the known clusters. In Calcasieu, we have, the angiosarcoma, it's mostly in workers. And that's some of the cases that Mike was talking about. So it's clearly as a result of the vinyl chloride. But to be able to say, this is how many in this cancer cluster, it doesn't. And the agencies fight severely to actually acknowledge when you bring them the data that it is a cancer cluster.
Let me tell you something about Bayou Den. I had already said that everybody's dead except 3 of them. These were Pentecostals. It's not a lifestyle thing. They didn't drink, they didn't smoke, they didn't party. They lived off the land. They ate the fish from Bayou Den, they ate the deer and all that kind of stuff. But there were people who married in, and there were people who had been there for 2 or 3 generations. So it wasn't a genetic thing. There was no cancer in the generation older than I am. My generation all got cancer. Every one of them got cancer, even the in-laws, even though they were Pentecostals. So the fact they're all dead now, to me, that's a cluster that, had it been documented, would answer your question. Yes, there's one there. How we go about doing anything is too late. I know that the outliers that got thrown out by ATSDR,
Right.
Bayou Den was thrown out. The people that were high from Bayou Den. I mean, this is one of the frustrations of calling in people to do good science and then getting them suppressed by politics. That happened with the ATSDR report by the time it was over with. It was sad.
Sure.
I'm curious about this, the notion of scientific authority. Earlier you mentioned citizen scientists. You're a chemist, and you've trained members of the community to do real-time air evaluations, and you have equipment, to help empower the local community. However, the refineries, facilities, also have their scientific authorities. And so this is going back and forth. And I'm curious to what extent does it really rest upon how courts and others view this issue? Who is presenting good science?
Okay, I'll do it first and then Mike will do it. We don't see the industry's data. On the Mississippi River, many generations ago, we saw some of that data. Like when they do urine and then they would just give one person their data. So we don't get to see that data. And when they're dealing with the agency and they're saying this is how much we're going to release or this is the accident where we released it, they never have to put that data up and show that their workers are not being impacted. My husband's from Sulphur, and a lot of his friends work at the industry. And I've had a lot of conversations with them and gone to meetings with them. And they know that the industry killed their dad who worked there. They know it killed their mom because the dad came home with all the dirty stuff on the clothes and the mom washed it and it came in contact with her skin. And they know it's going to kill them at an early age, but they like the lifestyle they have based on the money. But they don't want their children working at the industry. They want their children to get degrees and go to work somewhere else because they don't want them to have a life that is cut short. So even the workers admit it's having an impact on their health. But we can't get the industry's data and be able to review it. And then Mike will tell you about court cases.
It's not too often that we actually get before a real judge. And so, in a way, your question is not yet answerable. I would love to see some of these cases get before a real judge. There was one in Fisherville about a train wreck. Fisherville is in North Lake Charles, also near where the Tagga bus found the previously unrecognized cluster of gases. But the Fisherville train wreck released the same chemical that was in Eunice and in Livingston, perchloroethylene. What fascinated me, and which I sent in to the attorneys that were handling the Fisherville case, was a new twist, because the court was saying, no, it's too late, you used up your time, but so there was a need for some new piece of information in order to rejuvenate the case. And I said, well, there's a piece of new information. The perchloroethylene that got underneath the whole neighborhood is percolating back up through the shell layer, and not as perchloroethylene, but as vinyl chloride. It was being converted by the bacteria into a more dangerous chemical. Now, I don't know if that's ever made it to a real judge yet, but that's what we have to try to do. And maybe one of these days, some of the real science will get to some real judges, and maybe we'll get some real decisions.
That would be an awesome thing.
Perhaps those of you who deal with toxic torque are more able to speak to this than I. I know Lynn Luther's here and others, but There are two other wild cards with getting the information and getting it to court. One is the Louisiana Cancer Registry, which tracks, purportedly tracks deaths by cancer, but they will not release the information except on a regional basis. So you can't make the connect between the facility and the individual, purportedly to protect the individual's identity. But what they're really doing, is, of course, is preventing the causal link, or the proximity to individual facilities. When I asked them about that, they told me that they didn't want to unduly alarm the people living near the and I think, Lynn, you probably face this in your talk store. Here's another bar, and it's even more in cities. Without the information, you have to go in on basically scientific guesswork on causation, pathways, and impacts. And there's a rather pernicious rule that the Supreme Court has invented called the Doe-Bear rule, in which you sort of have to prove your science before you get to prove your science. And the court gets to decide on its own, you never get to a jury, whether or not you're just guessing. So depending on the court, you have a heavy burden of proof, even getting to put your proof on.
I'll just build on that.
Please, Lee.
Because I spent 2 days this month, actually, in federal court listening to a Daubert hearing on whether or not information that experts wanted to testify about cancer-causing chemicals would be allowed to go forward at trial. And the problem is that the court system is on a time delay under the Daubert rule, because there has to have been a published study and other steps along the way that cause this time lag between the time you can use the data, collect the data, have it peer-reviewed, have it, as I like to say, someone meditate over it, whatever you want to call it, before it can actually go into court. And so what happens is, in the meantime, what you're describing is that people are suffering, dying, and are unable to have their families pursue the claims because the people with the knowledge about what they were exposed to, what they did, are no longer available to testify. And the scientific process doesn't keep pace with the legal process. And just, some of the agencies we've been talking about today, they spend a lot of time collecting and studying this data. But the legal system, you file a case in a court system here like federal court, they want you to go to trial in 9 months. And the experts cost hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Okay, last question.
Well, I just want to offer a last thought now. What I find working in, perhaps the sort of sick twist to all of this is the more polluted the neighborhood, the harder it is to prove these cases.
That's right.
Because where you have multiple causal factors, everybody tries to hide behind everybody else. And the case just spirals out of control. You do discovery on one plant, then you go to the next plant, and you have, just huge. It becomes a hugely complicated case to try to pick out specific causes for specific defendants. And you can name every defendant, but then of course you end up with 3 sets of law firms fighting you rather than one. So I found that working in highly polluted areas can actually be harder than working in areas where there's sort of one plant and one problem.
You're exactly right, and that's why what she was talking about, the congener signature, was such an important part of the ATSDR study. But they didn't finish it. They removed the lady, Dr. Danielle Devoni, and they removed Deb Millette, who were working on that aspect of the study. And she had to carry it forward, but like she said, she got a pat on the head.
Corinne? Not really a question, just a final point. We're talking about the tumor registry, and I just, for the benefit of the audience and people who aren't practicing in Louisiana, we actually had to sue to get the tumor, there was a lawsuit just to get the tumor registry released that Oliver mentioned, or Professor Houck mentioned. It's not, it's not even compiled and presented in a way that's useful to to toxic tort litigators, but there was even a lawsuit to get that because it was being held by industry, right? I think that was Richard Ayuk that was the Attorney General that agreed to let that go. You just struggle every step of the way.
I'd like to mention that the guy that runs the tumor register in southwest Louisiana accused me of tainting the blood samples with dioxin. How, how could I do that? Why would I do that? I wouldn't do that. And so the law firm laid me off and said, you shouldn't have done it. I said, you're taking his word and not me that's working for you?
Well, thank you very much. With that thought, and your pick up the torch and carry it on.
Could I have your attention just for half a moment? I'm not sure this was said, but Dr. Wilma Subra is one of the very rare winners of the MacArthur Genius Award. Yeah, what's saying is